Okay, as I said, our main message today, if you'll please be seated, our main message today is titled the, uh, the Original Calendar for Our Day. And it was written by Wayne Bedwell, as I said, and it covers the new moons in the calendar, basically. And I thought it would be good for us to go through it. Um, Basically, the Church of the Great God has the same beliefs we do, and I've attended their services. I know some of the folks there, so we'll be covering this paper today. One second, I gotta get my act together here. All right. So we're going to start by looking at Genesis 1:14 in the Tanakh. It says, "And God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to separate the day from night, and they shall serve as signs for the set times, the days and the years." The KJV calls the set times seasons. So what was God really saying here? He said, quote, "And let them serve as signs for the set times and days and years." Are we to establish seasons by the sun and the moon? This word seasons in 114, Genesis 1:14 in the KJV, it actually means set or appointed times. But these appointed times fall within certain climactic seasons: the late rain season, the summer season, the early rain season. None of these fall in the heavy rain season. So are we to establish days, the rising and setting of the sun, by the sun? Are we to establish years, all the months and days which are included in a return of the earth to the same location relative to the sun, by observing the sun and the moon? God obviously thinks so, based on what we read here in Genesis 1:14. And it appears that David thought so as well. Let's look at Psalm 8:3, which says, "When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars, which you have set in place or ordained." And also Psalm 104:19, "He made the moon mark off the seasons, appointed times. The sun knows when to set." And Psalm 89:37, "It will be established forever like the moon, the faithful witness in the sky." So Yehovah nowhere in the Bible specifically states that we should have a calendar. He only gives us the rules from which we can build one. And from a practical sense, however, calendars form an important part of our lives. Calendars are important to mankind to enable us to plan events in the future and keep track of events in the past. They have existed for many thousands of years. And some have been based on the sun, some on the moon. The Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Romans, even the Aztecs had their own calendars. The major calendars of today are the Roman, the Muslim, and the Jewish. And it's to the Jewish calendar that this study is addressed. And this study uses the term Jewish calendar rather than Hebrew calendar because that is the most commonly used term. So by creating the sun and the moon, God established three basic units of time for all mankind: the day, the lunar month, and the year. The sun sets, rises, and sets again. This cycle of rising and setting is a day. The lunar month is a cycle of the moon, beginning as the sun and moon pass each other, a new moon, the moon next appearing as a thin crescent, waxing, then a full moon, and finally shrinking or waning and disappearing again as it approaches conjunction with the sun. The astronomical conjunction occurs when the center of the sun, the center of the moon, and the center of the earth are exactly lined up along the same earth longitude. Because of the dominant brilliance of the sun, the totally dark side of the moon, which faces the earth, isn't visible during the conjunction. The Roman month in use today has nothing at all to do with the moon. The biblical year contains 12 or 13 lunar months. And in addition to these three units, God gave us the fourth unit, the week. The week is not directly dependent upon the motion of any heavenly body, unless you refer to the setting of the sun 7 times as its dependency, because you would have 7 days, which is a day portion and a night portion. So let's describe the various units in terms of days. Right? So a week is 7 days. A lunar month is a little more than 29 and a half days. It's 29.5306 days. And a year is approximately 365 and a quarter days, right? So it's 365.24965 days. And these are exact astronomical calculations. So one other term that we need to define is the equinox. The equinox is the time in spring and fall when the sun crosses the equator and day and night are of approximately equal length. The equinox we are concerned about from God's word is the northern hemisphere spring equinox, which normally occurs on March 20th or 21st. The spring equinox, commonly called the vernal equinox, establishes the first day of spring. Now, the Jewish calendar consists of 12 or 13 months of 29 or 30 days each. The 13 months of the Jewish calendar are as follows. We have Nisan, which is 30 days. We have Iyar, which is 29 days. We have Sivan, which is 30 days. We have Tammuz, which is 29 days. Now, these names are the Babylonian names for these months. We have Av, which is 30 days. We have Elul, which is 29 days. We have Tishri, which is 30 days. We have Heshvan, which is 29 or 30 days. We have Kislev, which is 29 or 30 days. We have Tebet, which is 29 days. We have Shevat, which is 30 days. We have Adar, which is 29 days or 30 days if there is an Adar 2. And then the 13th month would be Adar 2, which is 29 days. And it's also a leap year month. So this 13th month was originally planned to assure that Passover would never fall before the spring equinox and thereby synchronizes the lunar calendar with the solar calendar. So in practice, however, the Jewish calendar now has predefined years in a 19-year cycle, which are to be leap years. And these are embolismic or intercalary years, which have 13 months. Leap years are designed to be the 3rd, 6th, 8th, 11th, 14th, 17th, and 19th years. There's 7 of them. So the 19-year cycle results from the fact that the sun, moon, and earth are almost exactly in the same positions every 19 years. In fact, the 19-year cycle varies from being exactly 19 years by only 1 hour and 26 minutes and 56 2/3 seconds. So by insisting that the Passover not fall before the spring equinox, the Jewish calendar does make provision for even this hour and a half. Let's look at Exodus 12:2. It says, the month Abib, pronounced Aviv, the Jewish calendar calls it Nisan, a Babylonian name, shall be to you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. And then in Exodus 13:3 and 4, it says, then Moses said to the people, commemorate this day, the day you came out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery, because Yehovah brought you out of it with a mighty hand. Eat nothing containing yeast. Today, in the month of Aviv, you are leaving. Right? And then in Exodus 13:7-10, it says, eat unleavened bread during those 7 days. Nothing with yeast in it is to be seen among you, nor shall any yeast be seen anywhere within your borders. On that day, tell your son, I do this because of what Yehovah did for me when I came out of Egypt. This observance will be for you like a sign on your hand and a reminder on your forehead that the law of Yehovah is to be on your lips. For Yehovah brought you out of Egypt with his mighty hand. You must keep this ordinance at the appointed time or season in the KJV, year after year. And we just completed this Passover season. Let's look at Numbers 9:2 and 3. It says, have the Israelites celebrate the Passover at the appointed time or season. Celebrate it at the appointed time, at twilight on the 14th day of this month, in accordance with all its rules and regulations. So Judaism tries to follow the above scriptures, which imply that Passover, Nisan 15 to them, right? That's when they keep it, must not fall before the spring equinox. But they have one big problem. The Jewish calculation now puts Tekufoth, Nisan, on April 7th, and the date gradually gets later. Many Jews recognize the irregularity of this date, and their calendar ignores it. But the calculation of it is so steeped in tradition that they simply dismiss the problem by taking the position that the rebirth of the state of Israel rekindles in us the hope that a new Sanhedrin, recognized by the whole people of Israel, will be established in our time. It will be the task of the Sanhedrin to make a decision as to when and how the sanctified calendar of Hillel II is to be modified in accordance with the requirements of astronomy and the Torah. A new religious court is currently being discussed in Jerusalem, and they also realize the day of the Messiah is near, when he shall renew our days as of old, as quote unquote. We too pray that time will come soon. And you can refer to Numbers 11:16-17 and Deuteronomy 17:8-12. So using the astronomical spring equinox causes a periodic conflict with the Jewish calendar. The conflict can occur on any of the designated leap years on the Jewish calendar, but thankfully not all of them. The same situation occurs again in 2008, Jewish year 5768, when Nisan 14 could actually fall on March 21st after the equinox. In this case, 2009 should be the leap year, not 2008, right? And this paper was written in 2007. The next designated leap year would be in 2011, or Jewish year 5771. Is correctly defined as a leap year because without the addition of the 13th month, Nisan 14 would occur before the spring equinox. Now, 2016 was another example, like 2008, of a leap year on the Jewish calendar that shouldn't have been a leap year. And like 2009, 2017 is a correct leap year, or was a correct leap year. And unfortunately, the application of the calendar rules is so rigid that Judaism loses sight of the scriptures that we've covered here that God gave to them, which strongly imply that the Passover must be kept at the first opportunity after the spring equinox. And we'll talk more about that later on in this study. Philo, the Jewish historian and contemporary of Jesus Christ, Yeshua HaMashiach in Hebrew, and the apostles, writes in his book, The Works of Philo, on the life of Moses II, chapter, 61, part 222 and 224. He says, Moses puts down the beginning of the vernal equinox as the first month of the year. Now, this is what Philo said. Now, the molad, the word molad means birth, renewal, or rejuvenescence of the moon. So there is really a molad every month. Both the words new moon and month are translated from the Hebrew word chodesh, which is Strong's Hebrew Dictionary 2320. Now, Yehovah talks about new moon sacrifices in Numbers 28:11 and in other places. But the only months he identifies for observing his holy days are Abib or Nisan, which is the first month, and Ethanim or Tishri, the seventh month, from Exodus 23:15 and 1 Kings 8:2. So he specifies that Passover is the 14th of Nisan. The days of unleavened bread are to be kept from Nisan 15 through Nisan 21. And Pentecost is kept 50 days from the first weekly Sabbath on or after Passover. So from the molad of the seventh month, Tishri or Ethanim, he specifies that trumpets is the first day, atonement is the 10th day, and the Feast of Tabernacles or Sukkot is the 15th day through the 21st day. And of course, the last great day, the 8th day, is on the 22nd day. And these are all specified in Leviticus 23, 4 through 8, 15 through 16, 24, 27, 34, and 36. So if we are to determine these dates, it's essential that we know when the molad of Nisan or Aviv occurs and when the molad of Tishri or Ethanim occurs. The Jewish calendar calculates the first day of all months from the first day of Tishri. The calculation of Nisan 1 is simply a matter of subtracting 177 days, from Tishri 1. All months on the Jewish calendar between Nisan and Tishri have prescribed lengths, like the Roman calendar, so it's easy to do. The calculation of when Molad Tishri falls is done by establishing a year thought to be the time of creation, right? So Tishri 1 in the year 1 on the Jewish calendar, and 3759 BC on the Roman calendar, and adding regular and leap years to it to come up with the Molad Tishri for the year in question. This description of the calculation is slightly oversimplified, but it's basically correct. And originally, the Israelites determined the Molads by physically observing the first faint sliver or crescent of the new moon in the western sky. This was the only way they could determine the new month because they hadn't yet developed the calculation of the new moon. Now, I don't necessarily believe that to be true. I think that man is far more advanced in knowing details about its universe than we give them credit for, at least ancient man. It seems now that they have figured out that you take the pyramids, like the pyramids in Giza, and you take the measurements of that pyramid and you draw a circle around the points of the pyramid. And that circle represents the exact circumference of the earth. That's how advanced their mathematics were. So I don't believe that they didn't have the ability to calculate when a new moon would have occurred. But this observance of the crescent, based on what I've studied, came out of Babylon, right? And so it says they knew that the cycle took about 29 and a half days, but observations did not allow them to simply use a 29, then 30, then 29-day pattern. There were frequent exceptions. When it was cloudy, the 31st day of the month became the first day of the new month. Their early attempts at developing a calculation were, of course, based on empirical observations, but they were hampered by many, many inconsistencies. Inconsistencies which were caused by cloud cover, the angle and separation of the paths of both the sun and the moon as they set, parallax, haze, differences in the size of the setting moon, apparent changes in the orbital speed of the moon, contradictions of observers. But as time went along, and with input from the surrounding Greek, Egyptian, Babylonian, and Mesopotamian astronomers, particularly in the study of 8, 9, and 19-year cycles, they gradually developed a calculation to determine the Molads. Centuries of testing refined the calculation to what the Jewish calendar is today. The use of the crescent moon is to determine the new month is not mentioned in the Bible, right? There's no mention of a crescent moon, but neither is a specific calculation. The use of a calculated molad is in evidence as early as King David in 1 Samuel 20, verse 5. It was known in advance when the new moon would be celebrated. If the new moon could only be determined by the crescent moon, how could David, Jonathan, and King Saul have known to plan a banquet the next day? How could they know that they could observe the new moon the next day? Without a calculated molad, could they really have planned their banquet if it were cloudy? If the current day was the 28th, how could they know they would be able to see the moon on the 29th? If it were the 29th, how could they know they could see it on the 30th? 1 Samuel 20, verse 5, seems to say that they had a calculated molad in the days of King David and Saul. And the calculation may have been imperfect. It still is, but they had one. As one person expressed it, calculation and calendars are twins. So development of the molad calculation and the receipt of reports of observations were managed and judged by the Sanhedrin, which was the religious court. So about the year 358 AD, when persecution forced an end to the Sanhedrin, the calculation was made available to rabbis and others. Now, one interesting thing about the molad calculation is that it is designed to determine the time of the conjunction of the sun and the moon, not the first visible crescent. The use of the crescent moon was the best means they had available until the molad calculation came along. They obviously knew what they were striving for. The new crescent moon cannot be seen less than about 16 hours after the conjunction. But as good as the molad calculation is, it is still not perfect, even today. One problem comes from the fact that some of the rules of the molad calculation are not in the way God told us to do it. Also, it is technically inconsistent with astronomy. Again, the new moon is to determine the molad, and while days are designed to be of equal length, for example, on a calendar, 177 days before Tishri 1 is Nisan 1, the new moon may not agree. Why not? Because while the calendar is consistent, every day contains the same amount of time, the moon's speed from horizon to horizon is not. The moon is on an elliptical, not circular orbit around the Earth. Its path takes it farther than closer to the Earth. Now, what happens when the moon is closer to the Earth? Its speed from horizon to horizon increases. And conversely, when it's farthest from the Earth, its speed decreases. And what happens then when you try to compute the molad with fixed length days? Well, they miss the mark. Time variation of this mean molad versus the actual new moon can vary by as much as plus or minus 17 hours. And we have some charts that we'll see in part 2 of this study. Now that error can easily place one into the preceding day or the next day, right? So the new moon, depending on that variation, could be off by a day. Now you can see why we can't depend upon the molad calculation to determine the new moon. To be accurate, we must use the astronomical new moon, the time of the conjuncture with the sun as calculated by astronomy. Now, they also have these days of postponements, and postponements are the most inaccurate part of the present Jewish calendar. Despite the instructions in Genesis 1:4, Exodus 13:10, Exodus 23:15, Numbers 9:2 and 3, and Psalm 104:19, and other scriptures to keep Passover and the months of the year at fixed or appointed times, the Jewish calendar arbitrarily postpones the first day of Tishri and hence every month in the affected Jewish calendar, for a variety of reasons, by the use of 4 rules of postponements called dekios. And they are as follows. So the first one is when the time of the molad Tishri falls after noon, the first day of Tishri is postponed until the next day. Their reasoning for this is that when the conjunction occurs after noon, it is not possible for the new moon to be visible anywhere in the world on that day. Of course, as we've already pointed out, they no longer use the visual sighting for the calendar. The whole issue of this rule of postponement seems to superfluous. If a person is born or married on a certain date, is the anniversary of that event postponed to the next day because the event occurred after noon? No. Even if the event occurred 1 minute before the next day, the anniversary is assigned to the day on which the event occurred. The second rule, when the Molad Tishri falls on a Sunday, Wednesday, or Friday, Tishri 1 is postponed until the next day. The reason for not allowing it to fall on Wednesday, Friday, or Friday is to prevent atonement from falling on Friday or Sunday. This is to avoid having 2 days in a row when it is forbidden to prepare food. Tishri 1 falling on Sunday is postponed to prevent the Judaic festival of Hoshana Rabbah, the 7th day of the Feast of Tabernacles, from falling on the weekly Sabbath, when certain customs traditional to the festival could not be performed. The previous months of Mar Cheshvan or Heshvan and Kislev, because they are allowed to have either 29 or 30 days, are used to accommodate these postponements. The other two postponements occur infrequently. So the third one, when the Molad Tishri of a common year falls on Tuesday, 3 hours, 204 parts or later, the third rule of postponement is applied. Since this places Tishri 1 on a Wednesday, it must be postponed again to Thursday. There are 1080 parts per hour. Sounds kind of complex. And then the last one, when in a common year following a leap year or embolismic year, the Molad Tishri occurs on Monday, 9 hours, 589 parts or later. The fourth rule of postponement is applied by postponing the first of Tishri to Tuesday. So as you can see, these rules of postponement, right, which were implemented by Rabbi Hillel II, I think in 325 AD, allow for the shifting of the days, which quite frankly, they don't have the authority to do. So as just mentioned, the postponements are additive. Let's take the year 2011, for example. The Molad Tishri is calculated to occur at 5:08 p.m. in Jerusalem time on Tuesday, September 27th. Now, because it was after noon, the first day of the month and year is postponed to Wednesday. Wednesday is a forbidden day, so it is postponed again until Thursday, the 29th. So that's 2 days later than the conjunction of the sun and moon, which occurred at 1:10 p.m. Jerusalem time on September 27th. So at this point, you may agree that the postponements have caused the Jewish calendar to become hopelessly inaccurate. And as you can see, these rules are all folderol when you set the first day of the month as God specifies. Right? They're all useless. They're not needed. Yes, the presently used Jewish calendar is seriously flawed when comparing it with God's Word. And that's why we don't use it. Now, most of the churches of God do follow the Jewish calendar. So they're keeping all of the holy days on the wrong days. Well, most of the time. Sometimes they do coincide. And what does God's word say about adjusting his specifications to our convenience? Let's look at Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 2. It says, "Do not add to what I command you, and do not subtract from it, but keep the commands of Yehovah your Elohim that I give you." Deuteronomy 12:32. "See that you do all I command you. Do not add to it or take away from it." And in Matthew 23, 1 through 3. "Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, 'The teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. So you must obey them and do everything they tell you, but do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach.'" And we can look at some end notes later on a commentary of Matthew 23, 1 through 3. As I've said before, when you read this in the Hebrew Matthew, it reads very differently. And this is whether it was by error or intentional, it implies that the Pharisees have authority that they do not have. In fact, Christ proved that Pharisaical authority was removed because it was moved to the priesthood of Melchizedek as opposed to the Aaronic priesthood. The Pharisees took over the leadership of the temple soon after Christ's crucifixion. About 300 years later, Hillel II set up the postponement system. And this is evidenced by the Talmud, which was written about 100 to 200 AD, and which does not mention any of the postponements, but does mention a Saturday, Sivan 6. Now, under the rules of postponement, Sivan 6 cannot fall on a Saturday because Tishri 1 cannot fall on a Sunday. Sivan 6 always falls one weekday before Tishri 1. So we can only conclude that the postponements were started long after the years Christ walked the earth. So why would we follow the Pharisees and their descendants in postponing God's calendar today? Some will quote Romans 3, 1 through 2, which assigns to the Jews the responsibility for keeping the oracles or the words of God. Those who do not think oracles are the written utterances and laws of God might refer to Acts 7:38. Now, the Jews have done a pretty good job protecting the scrolls, etc. Now, unfortunately, their religious leaders do not do as good a job obeying the words that they protect so well, a point Christ made to them on numerous occasions, right? Calls them hypocrites time and again. However, many do not keep the holy days according to the Jewish calendar anyway. For instance, the Jewish calendar specifies Shavuot, or Pentecost, on Sivan 6. This is contrary to the instructions in Leviticus 23. We believe we should keep it on the 8th Sunday from the first weekly Sabbath falling on or after the Passover, as the scripture instructs. The Jewish calendar reflects what is known as the Pharisaic Pentecost. We keep what is known as the Sadducean Pentecost, and we'll discuss the calculation of Pentecost in a later section. But suffice it to say, from the morrow after the Sabbath during the days of Passover begins the calculation. And as Jerry mentioned, this is the seventh day of the Omer count. So that Omer count is the count to Pentecost. The Jewish calendar specifies Passover be kept on Aviv or Nisan 15, despite the instructions in Leviticus 23. Perhaps they are confused by the seeming contradiction of Deuteronomy 16, 2 and 3, where sacrifices of the herd or cattle are included. and where 7 days of unleavened bread are associated with Passover, rather than the days of unleavened bread. However, in the Tanakh, Ezekiel 45:21 reads, "On the 14th day of the first month, you shall have the Passover sacrifice, and during a festival of 7 days, unleavened bread shall be eaten." Now, Ezekiel wrote this about 591 BC. So we choose to follow the Bible instruction of Leviticus 23 and Ezekiel 45 instead of the Jewish traditions. So why then do some follow the Jewish traditions instead of God's instructions when it comes to starting the year in the spring and starting the month at the new moon? Why do some blindly follow Jewish traditions, even to the extent of keeping God's holy days on different days? So that, brethren, concludes part 1 of this study. And then, as I said, we'll have part 2 on the new moon on Thursday, which is based on the conjunction from Jerusalem time. So we will end our formal service here